Afternoon and welcome to the Betsy and Walter Stern Conference Center of Hudson Institute. I'm Ken Weinstein, President and CEO of Hudson Institute. 50 years ago this summer, Herman Kahn and a then dark-haired and young Harvard Law School graduate named Max Singer co-founded a new think tank designed to offer a unique and strategic perspective on critical issues of the day. That think tank was, of course, Hudson Institute. And this year, as we celebrate a half-century of forging ideas that promote security, prosperity, and freedom, it is altogether appropriate that we celebrate the publication of Max Singer's new book, The History of the Future: The Shape of the World to Come is Visible Today. This important new volume marks, in a sense, a culmination in some sense of Max's long collaboration with Herman Kahn, who died suddenly some 28 years ago this month, and Kahn's way of thinking about the long-term future. Other think tanks, as we know, pride themselves on knowing what is going on Capitol Hill or in the economic markets today, neither of which are small accomplishments, I should note. But ever since our founding by Herman Kahn and Max Singer, we at Hudson have prided ourselves on having a strategic appreciation of the future and how that future may unfold, how decisions we make as a nation may affect its path. And this approach, I think, makes Hudson unique in Washington. Kahn, of course, predicted the rise of Japan as an economic superpower in the 1960s, the importance of the information age as an engine of economic growth and progress in the mid to late 1960s, and this was long before other observers noted these and other trends in the field of environmental and energy policy and international development, all of which we can be justly proud of. And Max Singer's new book continues in that tradition. It focuses on how the modern world will be remarkably different from all previous human experience. The book is a fascinating read. It is available in the back at a discounted price of $20, and I urge everyone to purchase it. Drawing in part on Kahn's concept of the Great Transition, The History of the Future argues that almost all nations are following parallel paths from traditional to modern. The book makes some very strong claims that we will analyze today, including the notion that one can predict the future of countries still undergoing this transition by looking at the history of countries that have already become modern. That the war system, long the central concern of nations in international relations and security policy, will be eclipsed. That tyranny will be a waning feature of politics and poverty largely eliminated. Yet, despite these challenges and these changes, the modern world may be worse than the traditional world because most of the things that have shaped human character will be obsolete. Max's book has already been widely praised, most notably by Herbert Meyer, the former vice chairman of the National Intelligence Council, who called it, quote, the most brilliant, important book of our time, one that should be required reading for every foreign minister, every intelligence chief, and every head of state. So it is altogether appropriate that we have a very distinguished panel to analyze this book today, and I frankly cannot think of a better panel of experts to examine this important new book. And I will introduce each of them in turn before they speak. Professor Michael Mandelbaum of the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, Dean Carolyn of Georgetown University School of Foreign Service, and Hillel Fradkin, who directs Hudson Center on Islam, Democracy, and the Future of the Modern World. It is, of course, a special honor and a special privilege to be able to introduce Max Singer. Max is both a colleague and a friend and someone whose counsel, wisdom, and fundamental decency I have come to rely on for some time now. I can't do justice to all that Max has accomplished in a career of more than 50 years of challenging the conventional wisdom in a wider range of fields, but I can mention a few highlights. Max was the first president of Hudson Institute and served in that position from 1961 to 1973. He serves today as Senior Fellow and Trustee Emeritus of Hudson, as well as Senior Fellow of the Besa Institute in Jerusalem, where he now lives. Max's numerous books include Passage to a Human World, The Dynamics of Creating Global Wealth, which had a foreword by Irving Kristol by Transaction Press, and that appeared in 1989. The Real World Order, Zones of Peace, Zones of Turmoil, with Aaron Wildofsky in 1996, which won the 1996 Gravemeyer Award for Ideas Improving World Order. Max's articles have appeared in literally every major American publication, including the Atlantic Monthly and the New York Times Magazine. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to turn the microphone over to Max Singer.
Thank you very much, Ken. I'm very honored by the exaggerations in your introduction, but I'm looking forward to hearing some reactions to my book, because I regard it as a discussion opener to stimulate different views and to get people to address something which normally they don't, which is, where are we going in the long term? Doesn't come up every day, but it is, I believe, a part of each of our thinking about the world, and so it's worth considering. I'm often accused of being an optimist, and I have a complicated reaction to that, and I want to start then by mentioning the idea that there are three different kinds of optimists. There's the predicting optimist, who says, my team is going to win the pennant this year. There's the defining optimist, which is the little boy who says, when I get my puppy, the world will be wonderful. And finally, there's the recognizing optimist, which is the little girl who's lost in the woods at night with her little brother, and she tells him, don't worry, Johnny, in the morning it will be light again. I plead guilty to being a recognizing optimist. And the great tool that I have on my side is I'm not talking about tomorrow morning, I'm talking about a very long time in the future, which has lots of room for things to change. All right. Ken has summarized, and I will, and very briefly, and I will summarize in only slightly more length what I regard as what is happening in history, which is another potential title for the book, and in some ways what I think of the book as being about. In 1800, all the world was the same if you look at the lives of ordinary people. And one of the big differences between my discussion and most of what you hear in history is I'm talking about the great mass of ordinary people, 90% of the population, not the small part that makes the history with which we're familiar, not the people who are writing, not the people who are fighting, not the people who are ruling, but the people who are doing the work and feeding, and who are the great bulk of humanity. Very little changed. I mean, the description I have there, traditional, and I guess you all have a copy, applied in 1800 AD and applied in 1800 BCE. And if you have a little bit of imagination, it applies fairly well in 18,000 BCE. The range between the richer or more successful societies and less was less than a factor of 4 through all that time. The bottom was subsistence, just enough for people to live on, couldn't go lower than that, and the top was only 3 or 4 times higher. So in a sense, nothing was happening in history for all those thousands of years. There was a lot happening in terms of culture, civilization, and so forth, but that was for the few. In terms of how ordinary people lived, nothing much happened. And that's from before during hunter-gathering times and to agriculture. People made their living under agriculture very differently, but they worked harder, were less healthy, less free, and isn't it all clear that it was an improvement at all for the ordinary person? All right. So that's what it was in 1800 and all the time before. Something happened in 1800, which I don't purport to explain. It's clearly had roots in the past earlier, but it only actually happened after 1800, and that is first England, and then in other countries. Countries steadily got richer more productive, which is the same thing. The only way to be richer, unless you have oil, is to be more productive. Countries got more productive and more populous. Before 1800, Malthus ruled. When countries did better, their population grew and they outstripped their ability to produce wealth for themselves, and so things went down again. All that happened was that the population increased and that the rich people could do more, but nothing changed for ordinary people, or nothing much changed. The big change, by the way, before 1800 was affecting many people was religion. All right. So beginning in England and the United States, and then other countries starting at various times after 1800, began the process which we're all familiar with. Countries gradually becoming wealthy, more advanced, changing their character. I mean, the basic thing is, in 1800, 90% of the people worked on the land. And after a country becomes modern, something less than 4% of the people work on the land. And that's just a symbol of all the other changes in the character of life and the way in which wealth is produced. So my picture is that we're barely into this process now. That is, there are only about 20 countries that have gone along changing, becoming more productive, and have reached what I regard as a kind of an endpoint, which I define as modernity, and I'll return to what I mean specifically by that. But roughly, the picture is the top 20 countries in the world today. Those are the modern countries. If you want to know what modern means, just look at them. We live in one. We know all about them. I don't have to tell you what it is. But my argument is that the same thing that we went through to get to where we are, every other country will go through and will be changed in the way we are. They will maintain their distinctive character as well. France is still France. It's not the same as the United States. But France's path from what France was like in 1800 to what it is today was essentially, in fundamentals, the same path that the United States took to get from where it was in 1800 to where it is today. So when this happens, when every country has become modern, then we'll have a modern world. We will again have a unity. That is, there was a unity before 1800 over time and space. There's disunity now. You have some countries that are modern, some countries who've barely started, and most countries in between following this path. Not like that. Sure. Before 1800, you could talk about the whole world. After all countries become modern, you'll be able to make generalizations about the whole world again. And again, the difference between the rich countries and the poor countries will be very small compared to what it is now. Now the rich countries are, say, 30 times as rich as the poorest. When all countries are modern, the difference is likely to be, as it was during traditional history, a factor of 3 or 4, depending on people's skills and tastes. So that says that we're in a unique period. We are in a transition. That is the key thing to understand about the world today, is that it stands between two worlds, the world of the past and the world of the future. Both have their character, and the character we have today is that we are in that passage, in that transition time from one to the other. One of the major characteristics of that is this very big difference from country to country, because some started first and others started later, so they're in different stages of this common path. But if you want to understand and think about what's going on now, that is the big picture that you should have in your mind about what is happening. This And this transition, I mean, everybody always thought they were in transitions. But this is the first big change in the character of the life of ordinary people in history. Essentially, there was no change. Life expectancy, how you lived, all kinds of things except for religion. Before 1800, there's being this tremendous change now, which will be complete. Maybe it'll be 2 centuries from now, 3 centuries, 4 centuries. I don't know. I'm not a prognosticator. All right. You all have the list. Just look at how different things are now, the way we live and the way everybody lived just 200 years ago. 78 is sort of silly. Just say long life, more than probably it is increasing. It'll be over 80. Almost everyone will be educated, at least at the high school level. What education means is going to change, but it certainly will not go back to what it was. Everybody will live in cities, even if they are out in the countryside. It will be city-like. They will essentially be city people in terms of their contact with other people and the whole world. Key thing is they'll live comfortable and healthy lives. Their work will be mental or craft and not physical. Very destructive to conventional definitions of masculinity. And here, the main economy will be commercial and international. That will be true. That's already true for much of the world. But I add this additional dimension, information-dominated economy, and that's what distinguishes a modern country from an almost modern country. We could have said modern began 50 years ago or 80 years ago with the industrial. I believe that the more appropriate definition is modern is only the point at which has been reached in recent years when it was an information service dominated economy and way of working and way of living. You next come to something where I violate my basic rule. The basic rule of this book is that if you look at the history of the countries that have become modern, that will tell you about the future. If you follow that rule, fertility, instead of being fewer than 3 children, would be fewer than 2 children. Because except for the United States, all the countries that have become modern have fertility below 2 children. And in fact, all of the world is moving in that direction. There's no country that is not either declining fertility or already below 2 children per woman. And no country that once started declining fertility has ever stopped before it reached, before it went below 2. The United States went down to 1.7 for a while and bounced back, and for the last 30 years has been about 2, a little above 2, but a large part of that is recent immigrants from Mexico. Without them, the United States would be below 2 also. So if you're going to rely on experience, you'd have to say that the world is going to, people are going to disappear. That is, if forever each woman gives birth to less than 2 children, then the world population declines. The world population will start declining sometime in the middle of this century based on what we know already. How long it will decline, we can't know, because it depends upon what decisions will be made by our grandchildren's grandchildren. But there's no sign in current history that it will go back up. What I say is that modern life means less than 3 children per woman. I don't believe it means less than 2 children. And there the question is, who's an optimist? Do you think it would be better if world population keeps declining down to 0? Or do you think it would be better if world population keeps rising up to 100 million, 50 billion, 100 billion, whatever number you want? Contrary to the United Nations hopes, there's no reason why human population should stabilize, or that birth rates, fertility rates should be just enough to keep population level. Birth rates and death rates are separate, and therefore we can face either declining population or rising population. The least likely is steady population. How am I doing that, Ken?
You're fine.
Some of the next things are obvious about the relationship to nature, the fact that change is now a constant, that people have a great deal of choice. Look at the point about this is how different life is in these two columns. And the second point is the much harder claim that this description of modern will apply for a long time in the future. I think there will be other changes in the future, and I can't tell whether some of them will be as big as the change from traditional, but it's very hard to think that any of those things in the modern will change no matter what happens. People are going to live long lives. They're going to be comfortable and healthy. They're going to be working with their minds. All those things will be true no matter what happens, as near as I can tell. All right. The last line I want to comment on that freedom and self-government will be standard. And basically the point is that hard tyranny is virtually impossible in a modern society. And the reason is that a modern society, to be successful, to be modern, to operate a competitive information economy, has to have many, many people who are good at organizing, who are good at gaining the trust of other people, have independent spirits and don't accept authority, are inventive and creative and imaginative. All those things are what's required to make a modern society work. And with a population like that, it's almost impossible to do a hard tyranny. You just can't do it. And this leads to one of my very specific predictions in the book, which is that China will not continue as it is now, with a productive, fast-growing economy and a political system which is a hard tyranny, which Communist Party maintains control by force, using torture, imprisonment, and all the kinds of things that it does to maintain its power. That one of those two characteristics, either its successful economic operation or its tyranny, have to end, and I believe in something like 30 years. And in general, it's just very hard. Singapore is a successful modern country, but it's not democratic. But that's special in so many ways that it doesn't do any more than make a freckle on the picture. In general, it will not be possible to have tyrannies when the whole world is modern. And that brings me to some ways the one piece of news in the book, and that is the argument that when all countries are modern like this, something else will happen, and that is that the war system will have disappeared. I get to this both by analysis and by looking at the current world. There's one region of the world, apart from North America, where all the countries are modern, and that is Western Europe, which used to be at the center of the war system. There's a quotation I'd like to read which really illustrates what the war system is. This is from Winston Churchill, writing about his time as First Lord of the Admiralty before World War I. And he reviewed the British fleet having a huge exercise. And he says, "For consider these ships. They were all we had. On them floated the might, majesty, dominion, and power of the British Empire. All our long history built up century after century. All the means of livelihood and safety of our faithful, industrious, active population depended on them. Open the sea cocks and let them sink beneath the surface, and in a few minutes, the whole outlook of the world would be changed. The British Empire would dissolve like a dream. War system said that a country had to depend upon its own military strength and its alliances, and that the real measure or the currency of international power and influence is military strength. In Western Europe, that's just not true today. Ask yourself, if the British fleet sank tomorrow, would it change Britain's safety or its influence? Not very much. None of those countries can imagine being attacked or militarily threatened by any other country in Western Europe. And they can't imagine doing it to any other, themselves doing it to any other country. The whole stuff of international policy is disappeared from that part of the world. That is the stuff that was so crucial, the military power part. Politics is the same. The politicians aren't any nicer or smarter or more moral or anything else. It's just that the vocabulary with which power is expressed has changed from military power to other kinds of things. Now, there are a number of other... Now, the key thing, I argue, is that's not just chance. It's not the particular governments. It comes because of the very nature of those societies, which is the same nature that the whole world is going to have in some 200-300 years. One of the key features is all wealth comes from the productivity of free people. Non-free people can't for long be productive. And so there's no way you can take very much. You can't grab free people and make them free for you. They're free, they're free. And there are other complications. The other key thing is that and I should have that up as one of the points, the role of violence in the world, in people's lives, has tremendously reduced. It used to be a central feature. It's now almost non-existent, except for people dealing with criminals or terrorists or the non-modern part of the world. So that the people running modern countries don't think in terms of the use of violence. They didn't use it to get where they are. They can't use it to get ahead. The head of GE is just as human as the head of Russian companies or all normal people throughout history. I'm sure he's a strong person interested in power, and I don't know what his morality is. I don't care, but he doesn't. He does not think in terms of killing somebody who's getting in the way of GE. It just doesn't occur to him. He doesn't make a calculation that it wouldn't work. It doesn't occur to him. That's very different. In Russia, it still occurs to business leaders. That's how they do business. I'm not saying everything is like that, but you certainly have to worry about being killed if you get in the way of somebody. You don't in the United States, and in most of and not anywhere in the modern world. Okay, so that now I want to avoid what happened to Francis Fukuyama, who I admire very much, who said the end of history is coming, and people heard him as saying the end of history is here. We do not live in a modern world. What I'm saying is a description of what will be like when we get there, and I'm also saying we will get there, but I don't know exactly when, and certainly not very soon. But remember, 200 years is a long time. Think back to what the United States was 200 years ago. So that a lot can happen, will happen, and can happen to countries There are some countries which make special problems, but I have some discussion of that in the book, but I don't want to take the time now to go into that. So I'd like to turn it over to people who are going to be making complaints and criticism.
Thank you, Max, for presenting those fascinating hypotheses, and I think we're going to have a very lively discussion. We begin our discussion first from hearing from Professor Michael Mandelbaum, who is the Christian Herder Professor of American Foreign Policy at the Paul H. Nitze School of Advanced International Studies at the Johns Hopkins University. Mandelbaum is known for his insightful research and analysis. His books are far too numerous to cite. Let me begin by citing his new book that's coming out on Labor Day, co-authored with Tom Friedman, called That Used to Be Us, How America Fell Behind in the World It Invented and How We Can Come Back. And we all look forward to reading that book. His many noteworthy books include The Frugal Superpower, America's Global Leadership in a Cash-Strapped Era, Democracy's Good Name, The Rise and Risks of the World's Most Popular Form of Government, The Case for Goliath, How America Acts as the World Government in the 21st Century, The Dawn of Peace in Europe, The Ideas That Conquered the World, Peace, Democracy, and Free Markets in the 21st Century, and my favorite, The Meaning of Sports, Why Americans Watch Baseball, Football, and Basketball, and What They See When They Do. Professor Mandelbaum.
Thank you, Ken. It is a pleasure and a privilege to be here to both celebrate and discuss Max Singer's very interesting book. As he said, one of his principal theses is that modernity, as he defines it, will make obsolete what he calls the war system, by which he means a state of affairs in which powerful states, at least, constantly prepare for and occasionally fight wars. This argument is a variation on, but a broader and deeper variation of, the so-called democratic peace theory, which is popular in the academic field of international relations and holds that democracies do not go to war with one another. Now, I agree with his argument in general and have made the same case myself in several places. So within that broad framework of agreement, I want to raise a couple of, call them questions, caveats, or perhaps amendments to this overall argument. Max defines modernity, as we can see to my left on the screen, as a state of affairs with 14 principal features. Whether this was a conscious echo of Woodrow Wilson or not, I don't know. But I want to observe that what he describes as modern corresponds to what other analysts have called postmodern or post-industrial. By this definition, the modern world consists, as he has said, of the affluent West, North America, Western Europe, and Japan. The trilateral world is modern. The rest of the world, as he says, is getting there, but is not there yet. And the countries that are getting there but are not there yet include the principal countries of the world's fastest growing region, namely Asia, with, of course, the notable exception of Japan. When will these countries become fully modern? Well, we don't know, but my impression is that Max doesn't think this will happen before the end of this century. So we've got the better part of 9 decades to go. Now, by this definition, given the history of the last 2 centuries, it is possible to conclude, I'm not sure I do conclude, and I'm not sure that Max does conclude, but it is certainly possible to conclude that the chances of destructive war now are rather quite high, and will be for the next several decades. How can this be the case? Well, what is generally known as the modern era, and I'm using terminology that is, I think, somewhat more common than the way Max defines the term. The modern era began with the two great world-changing revolutions of the 18th century, the French Revolution and the Industrial Revolution. The French Revolution gave us modern politics. Because of the French Revolution, the national and/or popular principle of political legitimacy substituted for the hereditary dynastic principle that had governed politics for centuries before that. That is to say, the world began the political transition from the rule of kings to the rule of the people, and this transformed the political world. The Industrial Revolution, which is, after all, responsible for the trends that have given us modernity in the trilateral world, substituted inanimate for animate power. The world moved from men to machines and experienced the greatest change in human existence since the domestication of agriculture in the Neolithic age 10,000 years ago. And the Industrial Revolution has, of course, transformed the physical world beyond recognition. The citizens of 1800 might recognize some of our political concepts, although not many of them, but they wouldn't recognize the physical world in which we live. Now, the combination of these two revolutions will ultimately create a fully modern world, and have created, as they have proceeded in the trilateral West, full-scale modernization that obtains there, that is here now. But, and here is the point, in the first half of the 20th century, before the full-fledged modernity in the trilateral world of the second half of the last century, there took place the most destructive wars in all of history. In fact, the most destructive parts of these wars took place precisely where modernity now reigns. And one may argue, I believe, that the reason that these two wars were so destructive had to do with these two basic revolutions. The French Revolution created new causes of war, nationalism and the modern ideologies of the 20th century, which are, for most purposes, secular religions. The Industrial Revolution certainly made the two world wars of the last century far more destructive than any before, and the Industrial Revolution also made war at least marginally more likely, because the march of technology led to arms races which increased insecurity and suspicion. Now, my point is this, and here my caveat or amendment or question for discussion. The most economically dynamic part of the world, that is Asia, is now passing through, roughly speaking, the phase of modernization through which the West passed when it was at its most destructive. For some purposes, at least, in terms of the procedure toward modernity, Asia finds itself where the West was in the first half of the 20th century. The war system has not died out there. Could it be that it not only has not died out, but is, and will continue to be for several decades, very, very dangerous? Well, this brings me to my second point. How to keep the war system dismantled or under control once modernity has been reached or approached. Another way of putting this, to put it in academic terminology, is how to deal with the claims of realism. According to the so-called realist view of international relations, the impulse for war, and what Max calls the war system, arises ultimately from the structure of the international system. That structure is anarchical. There is no world government. And this leads to perpetual insecurity. Countries become insecure about their neighbors because there is no overarching power to protect them, as the police force protects them in domestic society. Because insecurity is endemic among sovereign states, each must be wary of the possibility of war and prepare for it. Each must be prepared to defend itself. The basic text, as any of you who has ever taken an introductory course in international relations will know, is Thucydides' account of the Peloponnesian Wars. Now, with modernity, a great deal will change, but the structure of the international system will probably remain intact, at least for some time to come. After all, in the part of the world that is fully modern, we still have sovereign states, although we don't have a war system. Is it the case that the world will need a hedge against systemically induced, that is, anarchically based insecurity and its consequences, even when the world is more fully modern than it is now? Well, I suggest that this will be the case, and I have, in my writing, proposed two such hedges, which I believe will be needed for some time and are present in the fully modern part of the world today. First, the modern international order is more like domestic society. There are closer connections among sovereign states, and they have far more in common than was the case in the past. But even societies, even domestic societies, need policing. And for the international system, and even for the modern part of the international system, it is the United States that plays that role. The United States, I believe, and have argued elsewhere, provides to the international system some, although by no means all, of the services that governments furnish to the people that they govern within societies. That is to say, for some important purposes, the United States functions as the world's government. And among those purposes is security. I would suggest that that will continue to be needed in the part of the world that's fully modern, and especially in the part of the world that is not yet fully modern. That suggests, if true, that a robust and extensive American foreign policy will continue to be needed even in conditions of modernity, and especially in conditions of near modernity. The second hedge against the claims of realism and the insecurity generated by the enduring structure of the international system is this. Anarchy-bred insecurity leads to the retention of military forces. And even the most modern countries have military forces, although they don't expect to use them against one another, and they are dwarfed by the military forces of the country that provides security for all of them, namely the United States. So military forces are likely to persist under national control even as we move toward modernity. Military forces, by their very existence, create insecurity, but that insecurity, I believe, and have argued elsewhere in books that I have published, can be counteracted, if not neutralized, if all parties make those military forces conform to two principles. The first principle is transparency. Insecurity is reduced when all countries know precisely what forces all other countries have and what they are doing with them at all times. And you will note that the invention of reconnaissance satellites has made a huge difference here. The second governing principle of military forces that reduces insecurity is defense dominance. By this, I mean that military forces are generally configured to defend territory, but not to seize it. As it happens, these two principles are embedded in the arms control agreements concluded toward the end of the Cold War and in its immediate aftermath. So, my second caveat, suggestion, question for discussion is the suggestion that modernity and the abolition or reduction in importance of the war system may need to be buttressed, at least for some time, by arms control of a certain kind. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, for those characteristically insightful remarks, albeit somewhat sobering as well. Delighted next to be able to introduce Carolyn, Kaster, who is Dean of the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. She holds a joint appointment in the Department of Government, is a leading scholar on the politics of foreign aid, the politics of development, and development in Africa. Her recent books include Foreign Aid, Diplomacy, Development, and Domestic Politics, Organizing U.S. Aid for the 21st Century, and Foreign Aid and Private Sector Development. Carolyn Kaster has had an extensive career in government, serving as Deputy Administrator of the U.S. Agency for International Development, at the State Department as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, and on the policy planning staff. And it's a pleasure to introduce her.
Well, thank you for that introduction, and thank you for the invitation to participate today. It's always a pleasure to be here, and a special pleasure to consider Max's book, which I think is intriguing, is well written, is courageous, and yes, it's optimistic. I suspect he might have a lot right in the book. The good thing about writing a history of the future is that nobody can tell you you're wrong. I did have the sort of mischievous thought in reading it that if we went back to the Hudson Institute equivalent in Rome 1800 years ago, would we be having the same conversation? The world looked like it was going to continue as it was, or maybe even get better, but that was just a mischievous thought. I'd like to just make a couple of comments about pieces of Max's argument, and then I'd like to raise some broader points. First of all, one of the things I was surprised at not finding very much in the book about was education. A lot of the arguments that Max makes has to do with the way people think about things and how their thinking has changed in this modern era. And I would be interested to know what role education Max thinks might have played in that, because it does seem to me to potentially be quite important. A second thought was in Max's discussion of prosperity, which I think plays a key role in his argument. The way the world has become prosperous today. I did not see a mention of the way the world is so highly integrated, or not much of a conversation. The way the world economy is so highly integrated today. Much more so than the last episode of globalization at the beginning of the last century. So, and that has a very interesting implication, which I'll mention later, about his argument. The third thing, we tend to look around at sub-Saharan Africa and think that that's going to be the last and the long and maybe not ever place on earth that moves from traditional to modern. I have a more optimistic view, and I have not been a particular optimist on Africa or any other region, but I do think we're beginning to see some real progress there. Some countries that have, not all countries, but some countries have turned around, have sustained the kinds of economic and political arrangements that Max has put forth as an important element in modernity, and not only just for a year or two, but over a period of time. So something good to be seen there, I think. So let me make some comments on what I think are some of the pivotal assumptions and arguments that Max has made, and just sort of throw out some, not some criticisms, but some questions about them. First of all, you've just heard from Michael Mandelbaum a very interesting sort of realist approach to looking at Max's ideas. In international relations, as those of you who have done anything in the classroom on it in the last 10 years or so, there's another whole sort of group of people called constructivists. And these are the people who say, yes, power is important in the world, but the way people think about things, their norms, their values, the way they are used to behaving is also very important. And I actually think the key to Max's argument is a constructivist argument. So I will let Max and Michael battle that out. I've learned never to get between constructivists and realists if you can avoid it. But I do think there's a pivot here. There's an intellectual pivot here that's an interesting one you might want to spin out. As I read Max's argument, prosperity is the fundamental driver of these shifts from tradition to modern. Prosperity links up to democracy. We're not really sure how, which comes first, democracy or prosperity, and sometimes one and sometimes the other, perhaps. And then that gives people reason. I'm really oversimplifying. I apologize, Max. I'm oversimplifying. But that gives people reason over time not to think about war, because, of course, war could destroy both of those. But I guess history suggests a little bit to us that people can be motivated by ideological, religious, nationalistic thoughts and beliefs that even can drive them to discard the value of prosperity for the value of war, for whatever reasons. And I think we've seen it in the recent world, and we'll probably see it again. It's not unfamiliar. So the question is this relationship, is prosperity enough to keep us all moving in the direction of the modern world as he has defined it? Or are there things that could reverse that? And how many things, what nature of things might we need to see that reversal? Something very major, obviously. But here, it seems to me, is where the highly integrated world we're living in makes a dangerous contribution to the possibility that we could be stopped and turned back from modernity to traditionalism. Because my sense is that it doesn't take much in the way of technological savvy to disrupt this world we live in. I mean, all the conversations about cybersecurity are a sort of reflection of that. But if you think about how much our economy is so based on things like electronic information, things like electricity, for example, the transportation system, the finance system, the distribution of food, a whole lot of things could happen in a very bad situation that could, for a short term, or maybe not a short term, I think, send us back to the traditional world. And so the question here is, I think, what kind of thing could make that happen? How do we falsify or think about falsifying Max's argument? What would make that turn back? So that I think that's something really worth thinking about. A second thing is, Max has made an argument that is based on structure, really, as I see it, sort of structure of societies, the way people behave within those structures and reinforce those structures. I'm always impressed with the role of contingency in history. I got a little fascinated with Abraham Lincoln a couple of years ago, and read a zillion books. And the more I read about Abraham Lincoln and his assumption of the presidency at the time that the Civil War was beginning, the more I thought, Bismarck was right. Mm-hmm. God has a special providence for, drunkards, thieves in the United States of America. Mm-hmm. I may have gotten that slightly wrong, but I think he was a man who, it seems to me, had the fortitude to resist the enormous pressures to give in to the secessionist movement and so on. We can talk about this in terms of George Washington giving up the presidency after 2 terms. What would have happened in either case if we had had different people and not as strong people in those positions? I mean, I think the contingency, Hitler was a result of contingency, a bad result of contingency, obviously. Look at the Bay of Pigs. That was a pretty close call. So, again, what could turn us back from modern to traditional? Contingency, we've been lucky in this country, pretty much. We'll see if that continues for the next 2 or 3 weeks. But things could turn us back in another direction. So I don't know how you manage this kind of argument with that kind of potential problem. I'd like to raise one more thing with Max's argument, where I'm a little concerned that his optimism is probably based on history. He mentioned Malthus. Malthus was right until he was wrong. But it's the issue of scarcity. And it does seem to me that in the world we're living in, if you believe that the zones of peace are expanding, and I hope that's the case, population is expanding too, and as economies expand, the demand for resources grows. Max, I think, has a hopeful view that technology will keep up with these demands based on past history, and that we will be able to manage the pressure of resources, resource use in this world we live in today. And that, I hope, is true. I actually don't see the evidence just yet. I see that we have been able to use many fewer resources for the kinds of things we do today compared with what we did 200 years ago. But what worries me is situations of irreversibility, and that's really a climate issue. I know Max deals a little bit with the climate. But, if we are making decisions and acting in ways today on the basis not of risk but of uncertainty, we don't know a great deal about what is happening and how we might affect it. It's always possible that we could take decisions or act in ways that cause irreversible damage to our well-being in the future. I don't know what they are, but I think the issue of uncertainty going forward, because we don't know, we're in a new world here in terms of the resource use, and we're moving even further into a new world. You can see it in terms of food security. You can see it in terms of water, energy, and other things, as well as climate. Is that going to be part of a world we live in that might have an impact on our remaining modern and everybody else joining us? So I thought I'd just like to raise those pivotal issues with Max's argument. I don't know the answer to these questions or these issues, but I think they're in those assumptions, and so as we think about it, and as hopefully you read his book, you might be thinking too, what if? Thanks very much.
Thank you, Carol, for those absolutely fascinating remarks. You and Michael have gotten us off to a very good start for discussion. We now turn it over to Hillel Fradkin. Hillel is, of course, Senior Fellow at Hudson Institute, where he directs our Center on Islam, Democracy, and the Future of the Muslim World. He is the founder and co-editor of Current Trends in Islamist Ideology, which is the leading journal on radical Islam that is published today here at Hudson Institute. Hillel has taught Islamic thought and political philosophy at Columbia, Yale, and the University of Chicago. And he, too, has written with great insight in numerous articles that have appeared in such publications as The Weekly Standard, The American Interest, World Affairs, and a laundry list that is too long to go on to. And it is now my pleasure to turn it over to my colleague and friend, Hillel Fradkin.
Thanks, Ken, and I want to join with the other panelists in saying that it's a privilege to be invited to speak about Max's new and very interesting and provocative book. As we've heard from Max, his view is that our future is the extension of our already very substantial modern present to all corners of the world. Among other things, this includes the creations of zones of peace, whose model is today's Europe. I should say, I think at the outset, in following my distinguished colleagues, that I share some of the questions and even reservations that they have about this future, and especially the issue that it seems to me is posed most directly. What is the transition to this future? This is not an issue that Max himself neglects. He does forthrightly say that the extension or the transition to this future will face some obstacles. And some of those obstacles have already been described by my predecessors. The obstacles they describe have been framed somewhat generally, but I think for good reason. In my case, my role, I think, is somewhat narrower, and that is to discuss or address one such obstacle, but one which might be regarded as especially problematic, so much so that Max has devoted a separate chapter to it, and it is the question of Islam. It is not hard to see why, and Max himself states the case for it or gives several reasons. First is the contemporary power of the Muslim movement known as Islamism or radical Islam, which claims to be firmly rooted in and authentically representative of Islam. As he observes, it is the most important force which is resistant to democracy as such in our contemporary world. Democracy, that is, which forms, according to Marx, one of the essential characteristics of modernity now and in the future. And I might perhaps add, it seems to me, and this occurred to me clearly when Max was speaking, that Max's vision of why this is our future has very much to do with its egalitarianism, that this is the spread of certain goods to everyone, ordinary people, as you said. But beyond his opposition to democracy, Islamism is frankly and self-consciously anti-modernist. It thinks of, that is to say, of the future that, or present, frankly, that Max describes as modern, as an object of enmity. As such, it is the last principled as well as powerful opponent of modernity, now that fascism and communism have been defeated, or more precisely, the last principled opponent of Max's version of modernity, since one must recall that fascism as well as communism claim to be versions of modernity. Indeed, its opposition to modernity consists not only of its opposition to democracy, but rather because it regards Islam, its version of Islam anyway, and emphatically not modernity, as the future universal fate of humanity. Now, of course, radical Islam's claims to be authentically Islamic are subject to dispute. So Max does not leave it at that. He also discusses certain ideas indubitably connected to Islam, which lend some weight to the Islamist claim, and at all events seem to constitute obstacles in their own right. Quote, one is the notion that Allah intends Islam and its law, Sharia, to be accepted by all peoples. Second is the notion that war, or jihad, is a basic and also noble obligation, an obligation which would contribute to that purpose. All these aspects of both contemporary and traditional Islam obviously present a problem for Max's thesis, including the extension of zones of peace. On the one hand, Islam seems to reject modernity as the future, at least its future. On the other hand, the respect for war and its sometimes glorification run heavily counter to the sensibility which belongs to Max's notion of our international future. To these considerations, Max adds one more: the remaining power of what we might call the traditional or patriarchal family within Muslim society, or at least its version of this kind of family. As one can see from the male-female relationship category on Max's list. This obstacle is not unique in the history of modernity. Other societies, including our own, felt uncomfortable with a change from it, as well as many other changes in traditional life, indeed with the whole burden of change as such. But other societies have more or less crossed that Rubicon. Indeed, according to Max and others, we belong to a society in which we are not only comfortable with change, endless and restless change, but embrace it and look forward to it. Muslim society has not yet done so. In devoting a chapter to these issues and in stating them clearly, it is also clear that Max takes them seriously. Moreover, he entertains and elaborates various scenarios based on these factors, and which, if they were to come about, would lead to a continued Muslim exception to modernity, and one which would have large consequences for the world beyond the Muslim world, including that contemporary part which most completely represents Max's future, the European zone of peace. For example, if Western Europe, were to come under the rule of an anti-modern ideology, such as certain aspects of radical Islam might provide, it would entail an important regress in the whole process Max described, not merely an obstacle to the future expansion. Yet in the end, Max concludes that such scenarios are unlikely, and that Muslims, whether in mostly Muslim countries or as minorities in non-Muslim countries, will embrace modernity. While they will not abandon their religious attachment, they will find ways to adapt it to modern and even fundamentally non-Muslim principles and ways. His basic argument is that in the long run they will not be able to resist modernity's charms, any more than others have, any more than we have, and in fact are already on the road to succumbing. One may say that it is a version of the old saying that it is impossible to keep people down on the farm after they've seen Paris. It is true that just at this moment, the Muslim embrace of modernity that Marx describes is largely de facto, and one essentially of a leaderless mass. Muslim intellectual and religious leaders have yet to frame it, or frame a way of understanding this which would give it Islamic legitimacy and remove the sense of disloyalty and guilt which frequently attends it. But Marx believes they will have to, and they will. I confess I cannot feel as certain, nor can I be as certain as Marx that the Muslim exception does not present or presents two problems. One is the possibility of leaving a part of the world non-modern, and also the possibility of undermining modernity altogether. My reasons have to do first with the intellectual and emotional hump that Muslims must overcome, and the second factor has to do with the ambiguous consequences of modern technology. The third is what Muslim resistance to modernity might solicit from non-Muslims. And here I think I actually will wind up developing a point raised by Dean Lancaster, as well as a point by Professor Mandelbaum. The hump consists partially of the traditional factors which Marx enumerates, but it also includes a dilemma which is specific to the modern situation of Islam and modern Muslim sensibility. On the one hand, modernity has led to the decline of Muslim power and glory both political and military. The recollection of both the power and the glory remains powerful, as well as the longing to see it restored. That is, has been the source and continued driving force of radical Islam and other Islamic movements of the last 100 to 150 years. On the other hand, and for reason Marx describes well, the restoration of Muslim success, let alone glory, seems to depend upon the adoption of modern ways, political as well as economic, for those are today's royal routes to power. But if Muslims adopt those routes, they face the problem of accepting, if only de facto, the superiority of modernity to Islam. For over a century, Muslims have faced that dilemma without solving it. I suppose Marx's argument is that they will ultimately be compelled to resolve it, and resolve it in the only way possible, by the adoption of modern ways. That is, if one wants to overcome the sense of disproportion in power and success, they'll just have to follow the way of the world, the new way of the world. But there isn't an alternative which would apparently allow one to split the difference, and an alternative which has obviously already occurred to some Muslim resistors. It is an alternative also made possible by modern technology. It is to bring the modern world down through a destruction of its foundations, a destruction facilitated by modern technology, and especially, of course, but not only limited to, weapons of mass destruction. For example, I take and support Dean Lancaster's point that we are so completely dependent these days on the internet, technology, and so forth, that I'm not sure that it takes a weapon of mass destruction to disrupt those things, and what we would do without them. But at all events, I also want to stress, when I speak of weapons of mass destruction, I have not in mind not only so much nuclear weapons as biological ones, inasmuch as Marx emphasizes, and I think correctly, that the conquest of disease has been so crucial to modern progress. And I think that if such attacks were to occur, the difficulty for non-Muslims would consist not only in the destructive consequences, but in a doubt about the progressive character of modernity as such, that it would undermine, especially in the biological sphere, that if suddenly we're going backwards in our capacity to deal with a disease. I should add that this problem arises, I think, not only from the possibility of warfare or violence initiated by Muslims and directed at non-Muslims. It also arises from the possibility of war and violence among Muslims themselves. And for the long transition period that we face, and that Professor Mandelbaum adumbrated at least 90 years, there's a lot of possibility of that. Intra-Muslim conflict and violence remain live possibilities, including that most abiding of intra-Muslim conflicts, the conflict between Sunnis and Shiites. Nor am I so certain that modern man's attachment to modernity could not be undermined by other and less violent assaults, such as attempts at Muslim triumphalism in Europe. Max raises this possibility, but believes it would be kept in check, both there and possibly in the United States and other more advanced or fully modern countries, by the prospect of non-Muslim backlash. The non-Muslims simply wouldn't accept it. But precisely if that is the case, and if that is really actually to be a credible threat, for non-Muslims themselves in these countries, older or at least non-modern factors may come into play in their politics and in their understanding of modernity. At this point, all I can say is we shall see. Or rather, someone will see. Max himself says this process may take 100 years or more. And I think if I was forced at this moment to take a bet on which way it will come out, the only people I can think of who would collect would be my great-grandchildren or maybe my great-great-grandchildren. In the meantime, and thinking about all this, including all the restless change in motion Max describes, which I think may also be another cause of weakness in the modern project, one will get tired of it. I was reminded of an old song which captures some of the doubt I have expressed. It is aptly called As Time Goes By. And I thought I might close by quoting, and emphatically not singing, one stanza. It's still, perhaps this is the, I think of it now after Professor Mandelbaum's remarks as the updated version of Thucydides. It's still the same old story, a fight for love and glory, a case of do or die. The fundamental things apply as time goes by. Thanks.
Well, thank you for those very powerful remarks. I think you're actually probably one of the few members of the Hudson research staff who could have gotten away with singing it, having heard you on other occasions. At least the two of us up here wouldn't dare try, but let me thank all of the panelists and also Max Singer for just absolutely excellent presentations, very thought-provoking. And let me ask Max, before we turn it to questions and answers, if he would care to react to some of the absolutely fascinating comments that have been made.
First of all, I want to come out against Hoagie Carmichael or whoever it was who wrote As Time Goes By. Essentially, my thesis is it's not the same fundamental world. The exciting thing is that we're ending one period of history and starting a different one. And I think anybody who looks at the politics of Western Europe will recognize that this is a different world than it used to be. Human nature hasn't changed. The struggle for love and glory hasn't changed, but the tools of that struggle have changed because those countries are fundamentally different. Just want to make the comments that I can make very shortly about education. I agree that education may be central, but one of the interesting things is the extent to which people learn from their life as opposed from learning from what happens in school. In talking about this book with somebody who was working on it with me, we used to have a back and forth between he kept talking about ideas and the development of ideas in history, and in my mind I was contrasting that with the development of what happened, and I certainly don't want to say that ideas don't influence what happens, but what happens also influences ideas and maybe more powerful. The second point is the idea that what I say is that prosperity changes everything. That's a little bit true, but I rely much less on prosperity than on what it takes to get prosperity. It's not our spending that influences what we're like. It's our earning that does. It's what we do and how we have to change in order to operate effectively in a modern society that influences our character, our life, and the way we respond to things. Now, I guess the prosperity also does. You can't separate them, but I think the focus ought to be on how people produce. That's why Saudi Arabia is not a modern country, no matter how rich it is. All right. In terms of what could turn back, I believe any country can be stopped. And we've seen Argentina, which used to be one of the richest countries in the world, essentially held back by a century. We've seen Cuba, which was one of the richest countries in Latin America, moved to become the poorest by over 50 years. Any country can be stopped in its tracks or sent back by poor government. And you have a very great paradox. Government is absolutely essential to making modernization process possible. Until there is peace and minimum standards of law, it's not possible for the process of prosperity growth to go on. So minimal government is the first essential. But on the other hand, the only force powerful enough to stop the process of growing productivity is government. So government is the greatest danger, and government is the essential foundation for modernization and staying modern. One of the problems, I think, with worrying about whether Islam can become modern or will become modern is that Islam is in so many parts of the world. Seems to me that the strong statements apply mostly to the Arab countries, maybe to Iran, but there are 150 million Muslims in India. It's very hard for me to see how India can become a modern country and have those 150 million Muslim Indians not also become modern. Indonesia, the largest Muslim country in the world, with even more Muslims, together they make something like 20% of all Muslims, shows no signs of being held back like some of the other parts of the Muslim world. So if you have 20% or more of the Muslim world acting like modern countries, it seems to me is very hard for Muslims in other countries to say, if you're going to be a good Muslim, you have to act like us, not like those other people who are free, comfortable, healthy, and prosperous. Maybe they can do it, but and I certainly don't doubt they could do it for a generation or 2 generations or 3 generations, but it's just hard for me to see how a major part of the world can live for centuries fundamentally different than the rest of the world. Okay, let's go. More questions.
Okay. Thank you, Max. As we turn it over to questions from the audience, there'll be microphones will come over to you. Raise your hand. I ask you to kindly identify yourself, give your organizational affiliation if you have one, and to keep your question brief. We'd like to have as much time for questions, and please direct them to Max or to other members of the panel. And also a reminder that copies of History of the Future are available in the back for $20 if you need to leave early. Great. Let's begin here.
Thank you. I'm Leonard Oberlander, Independent. My question addresses the relationship between the history of the future and an aspect of the history of science. Particularly, our modern era has seen a shift from mechanical physics to quantum physics. We have developed neuroscience to a very extreme degree. Given the different types of personalities, of personality traits, for greed, for will to power, and so forth, and given the difference between education as we think of it in our country, in our culture, and training, which is what some other cultures think of education, the application of neuroscience and related technologies to the ability to implant thoughts and memories and so forth, and essentially perhaps change history, makes me wonder in terms of what you have been speaking, how do you see the ability to implant, to change memories, will, and so forth in the structure that you have laid out in your book?
That's why I say that modern is not necessarily better. That is, I'm not an optimist when I say the whole world is going to be modern. We don't know what modern is going to be like, and there may be all kinds of things we invent that changes or tries to change, does change human beings, and we end up with something that we don't like as much. I agree.
But, Mac, if I could add a question that comes from that. Why do you think the discontent with some of these things in the future won't develop into a very powerful force? Discontent with modernity as such. I mean, we've had explosions of that in the past over the last 200 years. They haven't succeeded in a certain way, but as Michael Mandelbaum was pointing out, we became pretty close in the first half of the 20th century. Why wouldn't if things are really make us really unhappy, why wouldn't we sort of say, well, maybe this is something we have to abandon?
Well, we ourselves will make us unhappy. So how do you turn against yourself?
Abe Schultz.
Okay, thank you. Abe Schulsky, Hudson. Yeah, I'd like to follow along on that point, because it seems to me if you, say, go back to 1800 and you look at the progress of modernity, it's been accompanied step by step with a kind of anti-modernity. In other words, it's had its own reaction. It's a bourgeois life, and it creates its own, bohemia that attacks the bourgeoisie and, the counterculture, as we now call it. And it seems to me there's no reason to suspect that would ever end. And so then the question would become, if you go to some of the points that Dean Lancaster made, if the possibilities of disruption and fighting the predominant modernity are enhanced by technological change, then you might have a sense in which the future is sort of modern but beleaguered constantly by this sort of thing, and a lot of the freedoms that you talk about, it seems to me, might very much be endangered precisely in that kind of world, because the possibility of disruption by a small group of individuals so great that you wouldn't be able to run those risks.
I would say is yes. It is. You have a modern country, and there are a substantial but still small minority who wants to try and bring the society down, and are willing to use modern weapons to do so. It will be a difficult task for the society to learn how to cope with it. I myself sort of doubt that that will happen, and if you look at Western Europe, which is, and the other modern countries, which, by the way, I would include some other Asians beside Japan, it hasn't happened. You see all these anti-modern movements as intellectual or even political movements. The Greens may bring us down by preventing new sources of energy, but you don't see, Red Brigades or anything like that having any extended success. Now, maybe in the future, as there are more candidates to participate in this and the technology favors them, although the technology is equally likely, it seems to me, to favor the society that defends against them, it may be that they cause a great deal of trouble, although it's hard to see that they'll take us away from modern life. I mean, they may make modern life unpleasant, but that they're going to go back to even the industrial era, a much less traditional way of life with everybody on the farm, I mean, that's not going to happen.
Okay, let's take the next question. Margaret Whitehead here in the front row.
Margaret Whitehead. I'm a Hudson trustee and an independent scholar. We certainly understand in a major way your alignment with Kahn. But in writing this book, I'm interested in the way that you may have separated yourself or extended yourself beyond his theory.
I address that in a long note at the end of the book. And basically, I say this idea of the end of the war system is something I didn't get from him, and I think he would agree with it because I think it's right, but it's not an idea that comes from him. Almost all the rest are the kinds of things that we talked about, and that he took the lead in talking about.
Back. Yeah, you next, yeah.
Hi, Shelton Williams with the Osgood Center for International Studies. I have students here from the United States, Japan, China, Nigeria, and Saudi Arabia, and sort of represent some modernity of communication and travel. However, the point is that I identified them as citizens of these individual countries. Back to Michael Mandelbaum's point of the political revolutions, the creation of the modern nation state. Everything I hear sort of assumes that we will have states. That will be the major political entity. But you think about businesses and non-governmental international institutions, maybe they'll find them a little inconvenient or a little too traditional, and will sovereignty, as has been predicted in the entire time I've been studying, eventually fade away and become something else, and we'll have other political institutions organizing, or else we'll have too much chaos.
It's clear that it's not an all or nothing game. There are many international actors and forces today, and subnational, and there can be a lot of jockeying. I think the key issue is whether there will be one sovereign international government where no subunit has the right to say no and to maintain force that would permit it to do so, or whether there will be sovereign units below the level of the world, whether it's 20 of them or 200 or 2,000, I'm not sure it makes too much difference. I believe that we'll be much safer if sovereignty, that is, ultimate authority, is divided. And one of the conclusions of this idea that the war system is going to come to the end because of the nature of modern countries without changing the structure to an international sovereign is that it eliminates, I think, the strongest argument for world government. If the war system is going to go away without a world government, then the debate about whether there should be a world government becomes different. It's still possible for people to decide to prefer it. I think the case against it is better, and I think that's a safer way for the world to be.
Yeah, two comments. First, on the issue of setbacks, history does not move in a straight line. It moves in an irregular pattern. It moves in a zigzag pattern, always has, and is, well, I shouldn't say always has since modern history began. And modern history, as Max rightly says, and has been pointed out in other contexts, has become linear rather than cyclical. That is not just the same old thing over and over again. It's a progression, or as we call it, progress, but it's not straight down the middle. One would have to say, it reminds me of that line that's supposed to be the motto of the consensus school of American history. That is, those historians who believe that American history is best understood as a people broadly agreeing on the most important issues. And their motto is, America has never had a civil war, except once. So we shouldn't expect the movement toward modernity to be painless or in a straight line or without setbacks or without counterforces, including Islamists, because that's just what history looks like. But Max's argument, with which I broadly agree, is that if you look back over the 2+ centuries since the French Revolution and the Industrial Revolution, you do see a pattern, and it is a powerful pattern, and ultimately it seems to sweep all before it or seep into every corner of the world, depending on the metaphor that you want. So this prediction about the future is pretty well grounded. One point, it's certainly plausible. It's not just blue skying. There's a lot of evidence and a lot of logic behind it, and it doesn't depend upon there being no resistance or no setback. The other point I would make is about sovereignty. My question is whether, if there is no world government, if national sovereignty persists, and certainly going to be with us for some time, we don't have at least the shadow of a war system, the bare bones of a war system, the threat of a war system. And if that's true, do you need some insurance against it, something to reassure people or governments that they don't have to enter into the kind of behavior that was normal for the war system in a major way? And that was the suggestion I was making. But just to make one final empirical point, the question of the persistence of sovereignty has been one on the agenda of political studies, certainly ever since I've started in the field. And I think what we've seen, at least in my scholarly lifetime, is not so much the transfer of sovereignty to a higher level as the subversion of sovereignty from below by the free market. Markets are more and more important. They have more and more power. But that isn't power that accrues to any individual or to any unit. So it's not that supranational units have become so much more powerful, as we see in the agonies of the euro today. The European Union, which is the most important supranational unit in the world, is not all that powerful. What we see is the leeching away of power from the most powerful units that continue to be nation states, which means that the sum total of political power in the world is actually declining.
About setbacks. it's one thing for a country or even a region to have a setback. It's another for the world. I think we certainly should expect setbacks among countries. It's hard for me to imagine so many countries losing the understanding of how to advance that the world as a whole will be set back for a long time. I realize that I haven't described what I think is driving this process. And it's because I think this driver is still working in the world and will work in the world until it completes this task that I'm so convinced that it's going to spread. The process is very simple. People like to make their lives a little bit better, and they can do so by increasing their productivity. And there's an infinite number of ways for people everywhere to increase their productivity, and there always will be. And that opportunity to increase productivity and that desire for individuals to do a little better seems to me will inevitably overall lead all the nations on the path that it has led the 20-odd that have already completed, in my view, the transition to modernity. It is, you have to add, government can stop it, but it can only stop it one government at a time. And if stopping it is unpopular because the people there look around and say they would like to live like somebody else, then there's reason to think that government will stop it, but only for a limited period of time. Now, this has gone on for a long time in Argentina, and a long time, less long, but long in Cuba. So the ability of people to say they want government to get out of the way is limited. It's hard for me to think that it's going to be like the Third Reich of 1,000 years.
Ken Dillon, Marymount University. I'd like to pick up on something that Carol Lancaster alluded to earlier, and that is that there was a Georgetown University professor of a past generation, the well-known Carol Quigley, who wrote a book called The Evolution of Civilizations. And the terminology is important. He's talking about the basic unit as being civilization, not country or region. And also the term evolution really has meaning in his system, that you go through, for instance, with Western civilization, a period leading up to about maybe 1900 of expansion, and then things slow down, somehow get fouled up, and you enter into an age of conflict that goes maybe until 1950. And then maybe you have a chance to go back to a new age of expansion, or maybe you move into the next stage of his evolution of civilizations, which would be universal empire. And one could argue that we have advanced in that direction. So the question is, what I don't understand is, how do you fit his analytical framework, his thinking, into what has been said thus far?
Well, I guess I might have more of an answer if I thought more or knew more about this theory, but basically my answer is that we are heading to a different world, and the rules that applied in the old world are not necessarily going to apply in the new world. But look how different the two worlds are.
Yeah, anyone want to comment briefly on Quigley, and then we've got two more questions.
I wanted to, since the issue came up in the here and in the previous question about sovereignty and what kinds of things are needed, and in particular in Michael's talk about hedges, and I wanted to ask him actually how important do you think the hedge of something of the United States or something like it matters in the issues in the near term, both as such and because there's a question whether this country is willing to serve the role that you described before, and whether there would be anyone else to do so.
The answer is that, in my view, the less modern a region is, the more necessary a hedge is, and the Middle East is not modern, and East Asia is not fully modern, and therefore the hedge that American power provides is important, and the willingness and the capacity of the United States to continue to provide that hedge is in jeopardy for economic reasons, in my view.
Let's let the others time. I'd ask there are two hands up. Let's have two questions back to back, and then Harley, if we can get this question here back to back, and then we'll have Max respond, but with one response.
I'm Victor Stone. I'm sort of surprised that nobody, either in the discussing the book or in the questions, has talked about what I thought was at least a trend to the vast concentration of wealth in the world, and that as a factor that would hold back this very sort of egalitarian future of prosperity for everyone. That the very wealthy, whether it's in Russia or if people want to say Wall Street opposing any new taxes on hedge funds, or Saudi Arabia, if it's not modern, it creates its own future of elite educational institutions, but totally ignores inner city schools, whether they're in Detroit, Washington, New York City. And so the question is, you've got huge prison population in the United States, you've got huge welfare generations. To call us a modern country says we don't have to take into account those issues. And how do these other countries in Africa, where there is also a very wealthy elite, they come here to Harvard to educate the sons of their leaders, but they don't spread the wealth. How does that play in? I haven't heard anybody say if they think that's going away. Or
Sure. Let's listen to this question, and we'll have time to answer your question in this one.
David Bardeen, Independent. In the middle of Max's 14 points, there was a point about relationships of males and females. But my question is about proportions, quantities, not relationships. In traditional societies, infant mortality is one thing, but maternal mortality and birthplace meant a thinning out of a significant part of the female population after very young adulthood. Right? Today, we apparently have millions of parents who are using modern technologies in pre-modern but quickly emerging societies to thin out female populations before birth. And the question is, have you thought about differences between males and females and their significance? Is there any predictable way to think or speculate about what a real thinning out, continuing in that direction, might mean for the future?
Great, thank you. You want to handle those two, in egalitarianism and gender difference?
I just heard a report, a book specifically on the issue of the overpopulation of males in particularly China and Vietnam and a few other countries. It seems to me that's an example of what modern people can do to make life bad for themselves, even though there's wealth, freedom, and peace. How it will be handled, I don't know. I don't like the idea of there being more men than women. Whether people will do that or how that will work out, I don't know. On maldistribution, don't say the modern world is a nice world. If you don't like extreme maldistribution and it continues, you have a problem to fix in the modern world. But the maldistribution in the United States is not changing the nature of our society. We're still a modern country, and whether we're a nice modern country or a less nice modern country is for the people in the future to determine by their actions, personal, private, and political. And I don't know how it's going to turn out. There's a lot of challenges in the future. there aren't the challenge. There won't be the challenges that have been in the past of poverty, tyranny, and war, but there will be the challenges of dealing with social issues, men and women, marriage, distribution of income, and all kinds of other things. The concept I have here is to recognize the very broad direction of events without claiming that anybody can look at the future and know about all the specific things that we're concerned with in our lives.
On that note, we're unfortunately out of time. I want to thank Max. I want to thank our panelists for an absolutely excellent presentation. And discussion. And just to remind everyone that books are available for purchase and signing in the back. Thank you so much for coming. That was really great.
We can go back to the real world and do some work.
It's a pleasure.
Pleasure meeting you.
Hope you're